Kelsey Kennedy. I work at Cook County Higher Education. My job is to make sure that we have education in our community, that people don't have to go to long distances like Duluth or the Twin Cities if they don't want to. And luckily, the upsides of COVID is that we did get some great connections and learned how to all do Zoom a little bit better. And so we're now able to connect from long distances. And we've been working with Ojibwe language instructors, a variety of places. And one of those great people that said they were willing to teach at one point is Margaret, and also her partner, Michael Zimmerman Jr. And so we've really lucked into some really expert instructors along the way. And I know our community has benefited from that. And we are just excited to continue the conversation. I don't know if you're like me, maybe you read The Firekeeper's Daughter a while ago, or maybe you just read it now, because I know at Cook County we're reading it as a collective. But it is one of those books that I could not stop reading. And I kept like looking at it and be like, this is something that's super catching. And I listened to it on Audible. And when I was listening, there were so many pieces of the language that I started to understand a little bit better just because of the repetition. And I was like, oh, that's how you say that thing that I've been thinking about, but didn't really know exactly how to say. So that brought us here today. And I said, Margaret, is there any way that we could have some help with this? And you know what was really funny about this is that Michael and Margaret both know Angeline, but I didn't know that. And then I went back and looked through some of my my Facebook posts, and one of them was a really wonderful old, like a couple years ago, shout out from Angeline saying thank you to Margaret so much for all of her work on the book. And I was like, how did I not put these things all together? As I should have realized them all back in the day. So I hope that you will enjoy this kind of comfortable, casual conversation tonight on learning. We're really excited to talk about the language in the book, hear your questions along the way, hear about what Margaret's experience was with the book. And we're really going to encourage you as you're going tonight to put questions in the chat. I'll read them off. I'll give you some time as well to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and really engage. We do only have an hour though, so I know that's kind of fast and furious with this group, but do what we can to be part of a community of learners tonight. So if you have questions, think of me as kind of the TA in the background or the teacher's assistant. I'm going to be here just to kind of support the learning. So I may ask Margaret some questions, but again, really here just to help. Margaret, it's all you.
Miigwetchin, Kelsey, Buju, Gakanawia, Yewedin Digo, Maganit and Dijnakaz and Ishnabemong, Mage Margaret, Jaganashamong, Chijajago, Api Kwezan, Sawaya, Chaska, Minnesota, Daya, Chijajago, Nongam, Daya, Minnewaking, Wisconsin, Kinomage, Iwede, Kachi, Kinomage Gamigong. Hopefully, for those of you that have been using the language, working on it, some of that sounded familiar. I have been outside of Minnesota for my residency for a while now. I first moved from the Twin Cities, where I attended the university there and first started writing for the Circle newspaper in the Twin Cities. Boy, that would be back in the 80s. So we would say Mindamoye and Dow. I'm getting to be an old lady. And I started studying with Collins Oak Grove at the university. And so for me, because I have a great grandmother who left some evidence that she was speaking Indian, but our family realized that, you know, we should figure out what language that was. And it was clear that it was an Anishinaabemowin. I don't have any affiliation with a particular nation at all. For us, this is, you know, that's the question we've always had, but I think we know for now as much as we will know. So I don't have enrollment anywhere, but I have spent my life learning this language and a few other ones that are part of my heritage as well, French and Irish, a few of those things. So I try to do as much as I can to make it even easier for people to learn the language, because I think back in the 70s when folks were working on this, we had a lot of elders. And so my journey learning the language was very different than what people can have now. Now you can take the language at many, many levels. There's Head Start classes, there's kindergarten, all the way through K-12. I teach at a university that I mentioned. And there's just lots of opportunities. What Cook County does is great for people who are not currently in school. They want to just take a class here and there. So I try to help that any way that I can. So if any of you have a particular language, question or something related to this book, related to learning the language, I am happy to field that, because that is what I always wanted when I was learning. I wanted to have people I could ask, and lots of different people, right? Because we all learn different ways. Sometimes you encounter someone who just, they remember every word and they learn without writing a thing down. But then sometimes there's some of us that want to be able to write things and memorize them and look at them that way. So that's sort of my connection to learning the language. And what I've got up on the screen here, I guess you maybe see these little bits, maybe not, but I pulled up, so Ojibwe.net, I guess I could even start here and just say that here, this website that we have, Ojibwe.net, is now also a bit of a Mindemoye. The website's getting old herself. It's been around almost 20 years. And I started this with my friend Stacy Sheldon, and also Alphonse Pitawanakhut. And we were all living at the time in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there were not a lot of classes. There was one class at the university, but if people weren't enrolled there, it was really hard for people to learn the language. So Stacy is an amazing web designer, and she has descendancy from the Mackinac band up in northern Michigan. And Alphonse is from Wikwemikong. So we kind of spanned a lot of dialects, and we thought that was pretty special in itself. So with me first growing up hearing the language over at the Indian Center in the Twin Cities, and then studying it on campus, mostly studying first with Minnesota speakers, sort of Western dialect. And then Alphonse being out in the East in Wikwemikong, a very different dialect in some ways. The pace is a little faster. People often say they are vowel droppers. We tease Alphonse a little bit, but they're amazing fluent elders. When these elders get together, they all understand each other beautifully. And so we just thought there needs to be a resource that represents the language, gives people an option for learning. We've got things posted on here where people can dig in and learn some beginner lessons. People can do things with the language. So if you, for example, say, I have heard some of this stuff about the sounds of the language or the verbs or some of these things that sometimes adult learners want, those things are on here. We've got audio with them, that kind of thing. So it was this environment that probably made Angeline. I used to work with Angeline when she worked at the Department of Education in DC. That was when I first met her, long before she was a famous author. I'm always so proud of what she's doing now. And so she knew me as another person in education that had created this site. And so then what we did, see if I can go back to it. Maybe it'll work. Yeah. And so we said, well, this is wonderful. Let's put a page on the website that can stay here as the book kind of goes out into the world and, more people encounter it. Angeline was very lucky to have this book placed with Macmillan, which for those of you that aren't book nerds, you probably can tell though from how far the book has gone. Macmillan is a huge press. It is great for us to have very small presses. There's things like Holy Cow and some of the things, that Minnesota Historical Society does, including printing, monolingual books in our language. It's good to have all size presses, right? And so gradually small regional presses said, we'll publish some things in the language or about specifically Anishinaabeg people. But to actually see Macmillan really embrace this story with all of its language use, its specific location, characters who represent, reservation life, and in some cases, the way that they move from the island in their community to the city. It was amazing. So the fact that she was with a really big New York press was just incredible. I think the only other person to have that kind of visibility in fiction is, Louise Erdrich. There's a few other national level authors, but this is really incredible. So she had, I guess, mentioned to Macmillan that she had thrown in language. If you tune in when Cook County schedules a conversation with her, you can hear her talk a little bit about it. But I've done at least 2 conversations where together she and I talk about the book. So that's kind of fun. It is true that she heard the language a lot growing up. She talks about her dad using words, phrases, things that were familiar to her. So there was language that as she was writing this book, there were Ojibwe words in particular that would come to her, and she talked about how she would include those in the book. And she just didn't silence any characters that needed to speak in the language. She didn't erase that from the book, but she knew that also that because she did so much really first with education and other things in our communities, she didn't focus on, being a linguist or studying the spelling. So she said, I really want to get it all consistent. So I got the manuscript from Macmillan and read through it and had the same reaction Kelsey did, like, oh, this is great. I just read through the whole thing and had to keep, turning the pages and see where the story went, and then back up and really appreciate how much she had put in there. So the fact that she has a main character who is at a point in her life where she's really focusing on her identity and trying to represent her language well and speak both to her elders who are Ojibwe and her elders who are not Ojibwe, to understand how she fits in both of those communities, and especially how she honors the grandmothers in both of those spaces. It was really amazing to see. So we put on the site, I will just kind of walk through what we have here and then maybe just stop talking and see what questions you guys have. On the site, what we did was starting with, I don't think we give anything away if any of you haven't read it. I never want to tell the ending. So I will be very careful, no spoilers, because it's fun to read it. It really is a mystery that stands in its own right as a very well-written mystery. But they had these beautiful cards. One of the things that, I don't know if Angeline will talk about this, but when she had the opportunity with a big New York press to do a splashy marketing campaign to introduce the book, they commissioned an artist to do these cards. And we do have the name of the artist up here. It talks a little bit about it. So Moses Lunham is the artist, and there are 3 character cards here. And she wanted things to be represented visually in an Ojibwe aesthetic and really sort of have something that would be recognizable and yet still contemporary. But she also had each of these cards feature one of the phrases that were important to the character. So Donis, the young woman who is the character, Donis means daughter, had a phrase in English there. I think actually you can blow it up. So to know Zungadewin is to face your fears with a strong heart. Many people would have heard Zungadewin as one of the 7 grandfathers. People talk about including that, or Akadewin. Some people use, different words, but that strength that you find to keep going. Maybe it gets translated sometimes as bravery, but to have that word included as it is great. And then let's see. Oh, I hope I don't mess this up. To go back out of this. It's not going to let me go.
It popped up if you click your tab at the top.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it'll go. I might have to stop sharing to be able to do it. Sorry. I just can't see the thing to make it go back. There we go. So the other thing that we put in there for you, those of you that are real hardcore language people, which I expect in Cook County, we put the whole phrase, right? So hopefully you can see that. Maybe I can even make it a little bigger, right? So Gigi Kendan Zongadewin P Zongade Ayun Onaway Zagazian. So we put a phrase in here that was sort of a translation of that sentence. So Gikendan is to know something. So to know this idea of bravery or strength is actually to do it. So in this sentence in the Ojibwe, you see it different than it appears in English, because English is a different language, obviously, that has more nouns and different ways of putting things. But in the Ojibwe, you see Zongade, that's when you say you really are doing it yourself. So you could say Ni Zongade, you could say Gizongade, you could go through and say I am, you are, others are. In this case, because we're continuing this sentence on, this is saying you, Zongade yun, like the kind of yun that you use if you say Anin ejnakazo yun or Anin ejibimadazi yun. That yun sometimes means you at the end of a word. And so then Zagazi yun, that is being afraid or facing or having fear. So being strong and facing that fear. So it's a good example of how no 2 languages are exactly alike, and you can't always say something exactly as you can in one language, but you can get the point across, and it may mean even more. I love to see this echo of Zongade as something you do versus Zongade win as something you come to know or you think about as an ethic or a behavior. So that's one of them. And then the next one, the other character, Jamie, maybe I won't try to go back and forth because that got me in trouble. So this one says, I love you, whoever you are, wherever you came from, without our names or stories or anything, which in this context of the story was such a beautiful thought, because not all young people, I encounter this all the time, especially working on a big urban campus in Milwaukee, where we have a number of nations in our state, but also Milwaukee, like Chicago and the Twin Cities, is one of those places where a lot of people were relocated. People went, they took jobs, but many families have lost some of the stories. They've lost some of the language. They've lost a little connection. And so these two young people talk about what it is to know who you are and who you accept, how people understand their own and each other's identity. So it's a great, inspiring phrase to have. So same thing, we put that in Ojibwe, which if you can still see it, and this is the beauty of teaching always on Zoom, I can certainly encourage you as I do my language, go ahead and say it after us if you want, you're on mute, right? So this one, it starts with Gezaga in. Gezaga in is I love you. Gezaga in, which if you're familiar around there, if any of you have heard the phrase Gewabamin, so that's I see you. So there's always a little verb that's a kind of a kernel in the middle of most statements. In this case, it's zage, to love or be open to. We hear that zage in a lot of other words that mean being open or connected. So gezaga in is real specific, I love you. If I wanted to say it to both of, like in my case, both of my daughters, I would say gezaga inum. You'd change the ending a little bit. So that's the first little phrase. And then Gawin, Genanda Wendan Zin, Anuzawinan, Debajmowinan, Gema Gagon. So basically just saying it's okay that you don't have a particular nulswina, a name or particular stories or anything at all. So it's very close to what the English says, but you can see the little center verbs there and the gawin and the si, that if you've been playing with the language or studying, you kind of recognize, oh, that's a thing that's not happening, right? So it's nice to have these echo in the Ojibwe as well. And then the last one, the powerful image, amazing. You know, there's so many issues the book brings up that young people today are talking about, and, you know, and I have lots of activists that I think are addressing some of the issues brought up in the book. And so this is another really good one to say. So strong Ojibwe women are like the tide, reminding us of forces too powerful to control. Weak people fear that strength, which I will have to admit, I probably should read to myself more often. And I certainly, as the mother of two daughters now in their 20s, the younger one, when this had come out, I had shown them some of these and shared the website with them. And the younger one said, you know, it's important we talk about MMIW and Indigenous women and all the things that they face and boarding schools. And we remember all the hard times, but it is really good sometimes to hear a phrase talking about how strong Ojibwe women are. So it was really nice to see, you know, at least some readers receive it that way. And that is also the beauty of the book. You get all kinds of characters. There are some tough things that people face, and there are some, you know, people that really stand up to that in different ways, each in the way that works for them. So that's another one where if you, it's more of a mouthful, but right, I'm sure you're all up to it, right? So Anishinaabe Ikwewuk, that might be one you have heard a lot, right? So Anishinaabe Ikwewuk. So that's just Anishinaabe women, plural. And Mashkawaze is the verb for to be strong. So Mashkawaze wuk, Debishko, Agwayashkak, Mikwa Minogwa, Gawin Awaya, Deben Masik. So saying that that strength is like the tides and these forces that can't take over, more or less. It's a nice thing, I think, to be able to take some of our phrases and say the more complicated things. That's another thing that I know when I was learning the language, I would say, oh, okay, I'm done counting and learning colors. It's good to learn those, but it's also sometimes nice to be able to have some empowering sentences like this. So then the last sentence in that little card was that the people that come up against these strong women actually will eventually sort of back down and recognize their strength. So weak people fear that strength. Wenje goshiawat, mashkawazewat. So it's like it is recognizing the ones that are weak, recognizing the ones that are strong. So these are good phrases to have, and we have like the audio on there. So I don't know, I encourage all of you, if you were here tonight and took the time and you know anybody that needs to hear these phrases, you could learn to say them, or you could, listen to the audio again with them or something. The more we have our language out there, the better. Then the other thing that Angeline did is put 2 particular prayers in there. And that was really important. And I encourage you to ask her about that, Kelsey, when you guys get to talk to her. It was so important for her to recognize that many, many of our children, especially today, come from multiple backgrounds, and we can't tell them that one doesn't matter, right? So while you might really want to lift up one background, you can't deny or repress another one. That's just doing, the same thing that happened to, the Ojibwe. So she has in here the Lord's Prayer, because she wants to recognize how important that was to one of the characters. So we've got that in here in Ojibwe. I won't read that whole thing with you, but the audio is there, right? And to some people, they would say, wait, that's such a Christian thing. Is that something we say in the language? And we talked about this, with some students here, and I've talked about it with other folks. The truth is we had lots and lots of elders who did get along with people who came. When we think of what Baraga contributed, he had a complicated history, and there wasn't everything good about that arrival and interaction, but there were some things where when people wanted to learn the language, he was there to help them. So there are ways. Alphonse, who I mentioned at the start of this, his brother is a priest up at Wikwemikong, fluent speaker of the language. So we just have to acknowledge all the different ways people use the language. So she has this in here in, acknowledging that it would be in English and Ojibwe. And then at the end, the main character gives her own prayer, which a lot of people I think would say sounds a bit more like a traditional Ojibwe prayer, where she says, offers a greeting to the Creator and says who she is and where she comes from, and then asks for help to be strong and help women be safe and help men to be well. So we put those in there just because we wanted to give, if teachers are assigning the book, or we have groups like yours reading the book, a space for people to look at that, compare, look at it closely, play the audio back, and really just think about how she included so many different cultural perspectives in the book. I like that a lot. It's just one of the features of the book that I really think is important. So I realized, like Kelsey says, time flies by, right? It's almost 6:30. So I can stop here. There's more things that I could say about the language or about Angeline and her writing and what the book means, I think, for Anishinaabe fiction, but really fiction in the United States today, right? Who would have thought that there would be space in American fiction for a very big New York publisher to give voice to these issues and to allow that to happen in a way that was inclusive of the language? And the implication in this book is that Donis and her friends who are younger are now able to learn the language, they speak it with each other. The sense that the book leaves people with is, I would say, the same sense that I have of many of my students today, or my own kids, where the language was there. It wasn't long ago that people were in boarding schools and being told not to use it. But that is not the case now. We now have young people that can find ways to learn it, and they're doing it, and they are celebrating that. And I'm waiting for the first novel all in the language. I'm sure one of them will do it, or the film, or whatever it is. So I will stop there. Maybe I guess I can keep sharing if people have questions about anything that's on here, but I'm happy to take questions,
Well, I will just invite people to unmute themselves and ask a question if you have one, or put it into the chat, and I'm happy to read it off if you want it to be more anonymous. I also would just encourage you to think about things in the book that, along with the language, that were impactful for you.
Yeah.
I think that sharing those conversations and concepts can also be important. It looks like we have one person that's up and ready to talk. Lucy, would you like to?
Hi, thank you. That was just such a wonderful introduction. I really enjoyed that. I just have a question. I was listening to some of your pronunciations, and I noticed that, and I want to just clarify that this wasn't just the way I'm hearing it through these earbuds. Um, it sounded to me as if your um, your D's at the end of the words almost sounded like T's to me, and I
Yeah.
just wanted to know, was that intentional? Is that dialectic, or is that just the way I was hearing it?
No, it is true that there is on our website, I won't flip to it now, but there's a list of all the sounds in the language. If you're a real phonetics person and you want to look at those, it is true that the D's and T's and the G's and K's are very, very close. It depends sometimes which vowels come before or after it a little bit.
Okay.
There are times where people would be very specific to say a D. T's are less common. We really just don't have as many, right? So the D sound is the more common thing. The harder, more dental kind of T is less common. So you, like in mitik, like a tree where you'd say mitik, that's a T, whereas like the one that's still showing here, mino ayawat, it's a D, but it's a, it's a D, but it's, I can see how it would have sounded like a T
What?
to you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
right.
Yeah, just something minor, but I was just
Yeah.
listening to your pronunciation. So thank you.
Yeah,
I
no,
really
it's
appreciate that.
a good question. I don't think I had T's in these quotes, right? So unless you're hearing a T right next to it, you don't hear the difference much. But if you think of
Right.
examples like, Tikanagan or
Mm.
things where you're actually hearing the T next to the D, you might
Right.
hear it. Yeah, yeah. But
And
no, that's a good question.
And is it safe to say that if the D would be at the beginning of the word, that it would be more strongly a D, or no? I mean,
I think like
more
Dagwagan is
purely a D.
fall. It might sound to you more like a hard a D, an emphasis there, like Dagwagan versus in the middle of something or at the end of something. Yeah. And there are things too that I would say dialect between the East and the West is a consideration, but it has more to do with the length of the vowels and whether people pronounce those vowels and the speed. The dialect that surrounds all of you in Minnesota, a lot of people that teach now would consider kind of the standard dialect because it has all the vowels in it. I am also speaking slowly as a teacher, right? Like I tend to have a habit, unless I'm like reading my poems or singing a song or something, I tend to read in an artificially teacherly way, right? I think I do that when I
Yeah.
teach in my classes, even if I'm teaching a poetry class, not, all in English. So there is a sense that you could hear in, you could go to a powwow somewhere at Fond du Lac and hear 5 different people pronounce slightly different. And that's just personal variation, just the way that, anybody would
Yeah.
have. If you listen to 5 of us today say our names, we
Sure.
might all say our things a little differently.
Well,
Yeah,
Margaret,
thank
that
you. Appreciate
takes
that.
us a bit to the question that I was talking about before, is that in the book there was words that I think was being much longer that she chose to shorten.
Right.
And that seems sort of, as a new learner, that's like, oh, there's other ways we could be doing it in other ways. Can you talk to
Yeah.
just the shortening of language a bit?
Yeah, so we put in here, she used over 100 words in the book because I did a list for her of all the words, and we worked with the editor to just make sure that the spelling was consistent. And we offered I guess, how do I say it? It's like we all know to say Minnesota, but people that are not from Minnesota would say Minnesota. They don't know to say the T that way. And there are times where people will shorten things because that's the way it is in vernacular use. So we put them all in there and made sure we were consistent. So here are some of the words that are used the most or were pretty significant. I would say that she made a point of getting some of the other values in there. So humility and truth. Deba Dendiziwin, Debwewin, those are in there as well. Some of these other statements, Be Giwen and Jizagiguyen. There's phrases that are in there that are important. There are, like you say, I think if anything, most of these words are in their maybe longest form, but the infamous one that is shortened is the various ways she'll say Anishinaabe, right? So Anishinaabe is a verb. You can say I am Anishinaabe. If you're going to say you speak Anishinaabemowin, one of those, a lot of people would include in Anishinaabe Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe. All of those would identify as Anishinaabe, part of the big Anishinaabe diaspora. So somebody might say, in Anishinabem, I speak Anishinaabe, or get Anishinabem, no, I ask if somebody does. But then she puts in things like, well, the Nish person did this or that, or the Nishnob. Sometimes she'll say, well, he was a Nishnob, and that is very common. That's just slang that we've got in any language, right? So we've got that in English where people would, we don't always say the United States of America, and some people would even say it's America, like they'd abbreviate things different ways. So she does that. And I think it really, in some ways, that particular word being abbreviated, there's lots of ways your brain can follow that. She is asserting sort of a diasporic nationality. She's not always mentioning her specific res. She's reinforcing the way people are connected across. There's 143 different Anishinaabe speaking federally recognized nations in the Great Lakes, which is kind of mind-blowing. I think we should teach that in school more often. 143 nations that this is their language. And to abbreviate and talk about Nishnabs or Nish, I think is emphasizing the connection they all have, right? So she's not saying the specific reservation name or the formal name. She's just really emphasizing the way people are connected with that larger identity. I think it's also, we say, a lot of folks use the slang Onishin or Onijishin for it's good too. So, maybe it's emphasizing that as well. I mean, people who are using that kind of slang and speaking to each other, it's emphasizing, oh, those good people, it's one way to look at it. So, yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Dan.
Yeah,
Dan, you want to jump in? Maybe you're asking about this on top of it.
Yeah, excuse me. The question along the same lines was the word Moen was used in sort of like a slang context. I felt like, sometimes it was like, oh, you left your Moen laying around here, like your junk or your crap or something, it seemed like it was used in context. So it was a word that maybe has a completely different meaning, but it's not just shortened, right?
Well, so yeah, I don't think we put that one on, did we? That'd be the one people would ask about. So, right. Well, this is an adult class, right? So you always have to learn that nouns are different than verbs, right? And so in English, we might use, there's slang to say what you do. Well, the kindergarten teacher way would be able to say to a kid, did you make number 2? Did you do number 2? Right? So that's literally the noun. Mo is the noun for feces. The way goon is the noun for snow. Mizi is to make mo. So sometimes people will say, like people are going to go to the room where they do that, right? So people will say, in English, you would hear people use what, my students would say, the S word or something, right? I'm conscious that Kelsey's recording this. So you know what I mean. So she actually puts that in there. And what's funny is you're right. It sounds right. You can say mo is that, to add the win is this noun, mo-win. Like that's often what they're saying, to get your crap out of here or something, right? But if you're going to tell somebody to do that or talk about, you use a different word. So like you say, if it's snowing, you say zogipo. If you talk about the snow, it's goon. So there are a number of cases where the noun is different than the verb for making that thing. So if it sounded to you like Moen, in some ways it does, like Ojibwe Moen or Anishinaabe Moen. If you study the language for a while, that M-O, this will now even sound even worse, has to do with making a sound. Like if you say Anishinaabe, to be Anishinaabe mo, that's the speech of the Anishinaabe people. So it's the language. So Jaganash is the British or English people or Canadians. Jaganash mo is to speak that English or, that language. So that little morpheme can have multiple meanings. It's like minnow, min will show in a lot of things. It is not always going to mean the same thing. There's sometimes where sounds in words are just coincidentally the same.
Sure. So I should have said this at the top. I audiobooked the book. I didn't read it, so I don't know if it was a different spelling, but that kind of.
Yeah.
So I was
no,
just listening to it, so it caught me.
Interesting. Yeah. No, if you were just listening, you would hear that, right? And if you were listening to fluent elders, that sound mo would come up in different words. And it's just not always the same. So sometimes there are things like, the Miigwe, that is, connected to ideas of gift and accepting gifts and acknowledging gifts. And that's fairly consistent. Miigwe, it's a couple of paired sounds together that has a single meaning. But me, M-I-I, you'd hear that a lot in a lot of different words. So me as just me dash or me gwetch. There's a lot of M-I-I words, so that you would hear some sounds repeatedly. So yeah, it's a good question though.
Is there anybody else that wanted to ask a question out loud? Otherwise, you're welcome to put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm interested to hear what you all thought of if you listened to it or you read it. I, of course, am highly biased, but I think having that language in there adds to the book. For a long time, I think people didn't include it because people thought it would take away from a book and make it less publishable or less interesting to a broad audience. Were there any parts where you felt it was hard to know what the gist of the paragraph or sentence was with the language in there?
Yeah, you're welcome to put that in the chat, or if you wanted to comment on it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll take the first stab at this because, I'm never shy to talk. So I audiobooked it. Like I said, I actually listened to it twice. I listened to it about 18 months ago, and then again, just recently in anticipation of our book group. I really appreciated being able to listen to it because, my familiarity with the words and the pronunciation when reading is not great. So to have somebody else who knows how to pronounce read it back to me was fantastic, and as a result, I don't think it detracted from the context. I think I, maybe learned a thing or two because I wasn't hung up on the pronunciation or the lack of pronunciation, which can sometimes happen to me when I'm reading and I don't know the word. I just kind of it bogs me down. So I really appreciated that. And I actually had a tangential question to that. Did you, as far as the lady who narrated it, did you support her at all, or do you know anything about her?
I did not need to. Yeah, there's a lot of young people out there that do theater now that are the kind of folks where I love that I can actually say to my students, keep studying the language, because when you grow up, maybe you could be reading an audiobook that uses it, right? So there was a young woman who had studied the language. I believe she might have studied it in college, but she had experience with the language. So the person that read it, had been speaking it for a while, knew it, and it was a comfortable thing for her to just be adding that in there, which is great. Hopefully we have more of that. It just occurred to me too with Lucy's question. You see an example here, the Manitou versus Manitou, right? So that's an example of how that Manitou, we would spell that with a D. That's how we would hear it and write it. We would have traditionally, I think, had that spelling of it, or even when it was oral, when you didn't have the spelling, people feel that that's closer to the pronunciation. But many, many maps include all kinds of things that say Manitou, right, with the T, because when the French came in, what the French speakers made of Ojibwe was a little different. What the British, when they came in as English speakers and translated Ojibwe or wrote it down, it shifts a little bit, right? So people who speak a language where they hear a lot of T's are maybe going to hear it as a T, and that's how they write it down. So you have places all over the Great Lakes where what you see is spelled differently. I mean, I live over here in a county called Ozaki. They spell it with a K-E-E at the end. We would spell that with I's, right? I mean, there are ways that when people were listening, asking somebody, what is this place called? They wrote it down in the way that sounded logical to them based on their first language. So you can see alternate spellings often that trace back to, typically in this area, the French would come first and then the British after.
Thank you.
I want to invite some of those that have not had a chance to get some questions in to make sure that they have a moment, but otherwise I would encourage anybody to ask questions.
It's nice Janet added that it was fun to have it in the book. I mean, and I actually haven't listened to the whole thing myself either. I heard some of it, but I haven't listened to the whole book. It does make me kind of want to hear the whole book too.
Well, as I let others get brave, I'm going to say that for me, listening to it, I have been attending many of Michael Zimmerman Jr.'s his sessions of Ojibwe language that we offer here at Cook County Higher Education almost every month, and just listening to it gave me a lot of comfort and
Nice.
being more and more familiar with things, and actually gave me a little bit of sense of like, just use it. Like, you're listening to this book over and over again. It is practice. You're going to get some stuff wrong, but the usability became more real. Like, it doesn't have to be the thing that I'm just learning in a class and maybe I don't do really well, but I could be applying it. And that brought me to 2 sessions that I've been talking. I know I mentioned this earlier. It's just that application of the language. I think maybe we picked something up today. Would you encourage us to be utilizing that?
Absolutely. I think everyone that I know who teaches the language understands that it's always such a fine line, right? We are very lucky. I work with some folks in Wisconsin here who are working to save both Potawatomi and Menominee, extremely endangered languages, where in the community there are very few people that are able to teach it, that are able to speak it. They've lost a lot of their elders. To have Ojibwe around you, if you've got any way to learn it and use it, I think that's really the ideal. I mean, I think that, like I was saying to Kelsey at the start, I've often done work up at Grand Portage, and when you go visit the school up there, Oshki, or you visit the school in Cook County, where a lot of the kids from Grand Portage attend, the best thing for those kids is to overhear it. You know, it's just one miigwech in a public space can really change the way a kid feels about their culture and language being accepted broadly. So we've all got a lot of, state names, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. I mean, when you think about the history of this nation, there's every reason in the world for all of the people who are using these words all the time anyway, and to actually know what they mean, and then sort of be pairing that with other words you can learn. So, like this book has some very useful phrases. Almost anyone should have a reason to say Gazaga in or Jim Shin. I mean, we could change the world a little if we'd all learn to say I love you and kiss me in different languages, or just like I said, that little thanks. I was with a student on a camping trip in the summer once, and we went to a Walmart in the cities, and there happened to be somebody who recognized and knew it was that camp, and then said to the students, miigwech, and it just blew them away. For them to hear in a space where they don't expect it, their language can be as powerful as hearing it in a space where you do expect it. So yeah, I would be a big advocate. You can ask others, see what Tony and others say. But I mean, Mike and I both teach at a big public university too. So obviously our views are that it should be available and respected and something that folks can learn.
I love that, especially knowing that we have a fair share of, I think, educators that are attending tonight in different capacities. So
yeah, I mean, I think there are things people always say. I mean, obviously, if you attend, a funeral in an Ojibwe community or a wedding or something, and there are words or songs sung there, those are the things that are personal. And we would know, in many settings, when you're in someone's home or at a very special ceremony, some of that language isn't what you go and repeat later or pull into a classroom, but there's so much that you absolutely can, that, like we say on this website that we've created, there are some songs that, are ones that you wouldn't teach on a website, but everything we've put on here, these are all the bits and parts and things that you want people to learn, so that if they ever do find themselves invited into a space that is more personal and private, they've got some familiarity. They're sort of prepared to be in that space. So I think it's absolutely true that there are some bits of the language and culture that people keep private, but people in any language and culture do that, So I think all this other, all of what we have here, learning it, then in Minnesota, there are many, many words around you all the time that are Ojibwe anyway, right? So to learn to use them and pair them with other words is good. So yes, if we have educators, by all means, even if you think you're butchering it, show your kids that you're brave enough to do it. I always say that to educators. You can go onto our site and just play the audio if you don't want to have to work through it. But to show kids you're willing to learn it, it might help the non-native kids feel that, okay, I can do this if my teacher's trying it and they're not needing to be perfect. Or the native kids will feel like, wow, this actually matters. I mean, I don't know, other people on the call might have different opinions too. I'm not sure.
I really want to invite people into conversation at this end. So if you are wanting to unmute yourselves and we can share some conversation, I encourage you to do so. Or if you have questions, still, this is a great time for that. This is a book that maybe you've read, or maybe you're still in the process of reading, but that it brought a lot of, I think, emotions and thoughts about language, especially about family and connection. And so I hope we have some time to kind of talk amongst ourselves with that. But maybe if you're feeling still a little shy, maybe as you're thinking about unmuting yourself, Margaret could talk a little bit about the family language part.
Yeah. Anyone have anything they want to add? Totally can. What I felt was really nice is, as I look at these words, even looking at this list that we've got, and we tried to pick the ones used most commonly. These are phrases that you would use in a family to make it stronger. And you can see the language adding to that. So that was one of the things that I liked, is so when you're learning things like, Bigiwen, come home to here, Enjizagaguyan, where you are loved, talking, just learning these words and talking about them with kids. Humility, Debadendize, when it comes from actually being able to kind of lower yourself in front of others. That's a really interesting concept, right? When we live in a world where people are trying to have more clicks and more visibility and more of this and more of that and try and be above others, to talk about the concept of how important it is to actually be lower. That's something you find when you start looking at Ojibwe versus, another language. Things like, the cedar tea, or there are other, I think there were a few others, so Kinnikinnick, Ginniginigay, these things that people might know as, significant in the area, to be able to talk about those. Moshkadewashk is in there. These are things that commonly people will say, oh, I see these around in the house, or I know them. Maybe you can just flip it and start using the Ojibwe words for those. And there were, we had the storm, the light, the thunderbirds and the storm. There's other things a little bit about the weather, but they're just the words that she put in the book are ones that I think could strengthen families and could help represent the culture in really good ways. There are events described in the book that, she doesn't shy away from some of the difficulties that have lingered in these communities, where some of those kids are dealing with some pretty big issues that stem from events way before their time, but they're finding ways through it. They're partnering with their parents, they're picking up tradition, knitting things together the best they can. So I would hope, if nothing else, it might make you flip back through the pages and say, oh, here's some of these things. I typically see things like sweetgrass or cedar. I see those around, and now you can have another way to say those. Is there another chat thing? Oh yeah, that's such a good comment from Stacy. about having it in there. Like it is almost a shock. And it does feel so familiar in so many ways. I also would say I really like the way that the language is used differently by different characters. So you see how the young people who have been able to learn it all their lives dive right in and use it a bit more. And some of the elders in this story are a little more cautious with their use. You can see how they will occasionally use it with each other as this sort of empowering thing between each other in areas where they know some of the people around them might not understand it. For them, if they're in a community where the people who know Miigwech are definitely allies and people they maybe can trust. People that don't know any of their words, have never bothered to learn any, they might be a little slower to, take time to get to know. So it was interesting to see how the language started to represent, I guess, people's ease both with each other and with the culture. I don't know if there's other teachers. I'm curious to know if you're using it in classes or if you have students that have read it at all, because it's been out a little while now. Is there another comment here maybe? Oh, with Karen's comment, yeah. Yeah, this is so true, right? I mean, I always wish I spent some time this summer in Ireland, and a lot of people there, it was amazing how many people in Ireland had no idea that there were Ojibwe people over here speaking their language and working to revitalize it just as much as they are over there trying to keep their language alive in the midst of kind of similar challenges of colonization. And just having a book like this to recommend to people, to say, here, get a good feel for the communities in the Great Lakes. It was really amazing. So yeah, I would say anyone that's new to the area, or even maybe they've, lived several generations in the Great Lakes, but never got a chance to kind of get a sense of reservation life or Ojibwe communities. It's a great book in that sense too. Not every teenager has that kind of exciting experience, but you can tell where it veers into true fascinating fiction. But so many of the other things where the elders hang out together, the way the elders in particular, the old ladies tease each other. There's just a lot of little things where you can see the resiliency of Ojibwe communities and kind of get a feel for them if it hasn't been something that you've been a part of.
I'm looking at this group and there's some that still have questions, so please unmute yourself and just ask.
Yeah.
Can I ask another quick question? And I don't want to cause a controversy, but I'm just kind of curious about your perspective. There's a conversation about, just cultural appropriation in general. And, you're talking about folks to just use the language. And there was a little bit of a discussion at our book group the other night about like white authors writing about the Ojibwe culture, like William Kent Kruger, for instance, who's pretty famous around here has written a lot of in this area. And it's like, some people are like, no, definitely don't. And other people are maybe like, no, it's good to kind of talk about the culture. Maybe is continuing to uplift it. So I don't know if you have a comment, and if you don't want to wade into that territory, that's fine too.
No, I think that, I'm willing to give my thoughts on it, but it is just my thoughts, right? I'm just one person. I actually know him from back in when I lived in St. Paul, before he wrote his first book. And even at the time, I think it was somewhat controversial. And I know that he went and kind of hung out with people and talked to a lot of people, talked to elders, tried to be conscientious about it. He's not like a close friend, so I'm not like trying to do any apology for it, but he is somebody that I've encountered. To me, it was sort of jarring. There's one character he put in the first book that literally has some things that I sort of recognized as, oh, I remember that conversation, and there it is in your novel. But that happens frequently if you know a novelist. So I think that when people are writing, if they're really careful and they name how they learned what they learned, that is different. I know that at Birch Bark Books, Louise Erdrich's store down in the cities, they'll carry his books. I think I've heard her actually say, well, he's kind of our Tony Hillerman, right? Where it can veer close in some ways. And I think there are one or two books and one of his characters in particular that some people would say, oh, that might have gone too far. But in other ways, to have that main character, Cork, be actually, right, mixed Irish and Ojibwe, that is very common in our area. We have a lot of people that would be their background. So I think if you're true to it and what you don't know, you ask humbly. And in many of his books now, you can see where he names, here's the person I talked to learn what I learned. It's changed over time what he's included in those books. So myself, I try to write what I know and what's about my poetry is really about my experiences. I think that for me, there really is a lot of sense of, I guess I see a lot of Native kids that didn't get to learn their language and their culture well enough yet that I don't want to muddy the waters. And in some ways, I hope that other writers, if you include characters, you can research them well, but don't write Ojibwe people's stories for them, right? You know, whole stories that are like this one, where it's centered in a, you know, very much, so many of the characters are Ojibwe and the main characters Ojibwe. To me, to see Angeline do that, that's perfect. For other authors to write their truth and include Ojibwe characters, that makes sense. You know, that's nice. So it's a fine line, right? I've had young writers also ask, what do we do? I've had young, you know, white writers ask, can I include Black characters in my book? How do I do that, right? And there's no one good answer for it. It depends on how good a writer you are, how honest you are, how you know what you know. So that's kind of maybe a non-answer. I don't know. Or things to think about, I guess, because it's always just going to be a very unique situation. There are some very controversial books where people have written things that the communities themselves are troubled by. And that's always unfortunate. If you have an author who hasn't gotten to know anyone in those communities or tried in any way to represent them really accurately, that's always unfortunate. But I think people are learning more now to work with communities and include people. A balanced book that has a lot of different characters is great. I don't know if people on the call tonight have other ideas or answers for that too. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I can just tell you what I know as having been a teacher of writing and fiction.
Well, I'll just say, so William Kent Kruger's books, that was like sort of my first induction into anything Ojibwe, right? And I still remember a lot of the words that he uses in those books, like and what they mean, and I recognize a lot of them now, you know. And I just loved the way he balanced the characters and just kind of made them people. And I really loved his stories. And you know, I'm just kind of thinking from my perspective. I grew up obviously not a Native family, but my family background is Italian, and gosh, nobody spoke it because we're in America, we're not speaking it. And I remember my grandma was alive till I was 14, and we used to go out to a restaurant. She didn't speak any English. And I just remember being so embarrassed because she was speaking Italian and she was making my parents speak Italian. And it was so embarrassing to me, you know. And so I'm thinking about like what you're saying about including the words, you know, saying those words to people, making them feel welcome in that way. You know, just like I think learning Spanish in our country as well, you know, and I loved the way this book incorporated French even. And I just felt it really was embracing of many different cultures. And like, was it her uncle who was Black and Ojibwe? Yeah. And you don't know that right away. It just kind of comes out later, and it's like they're people first, and they're,
Yeah.
think it was very authentic, and I think the use of the language made the book even more authentic. So yeah, I'm okay with it. I loved it. So
Well,
yeah,
if reading William Kent Kruger's books brought you to a place like this eventually, then that's great,
exactly.
right? You know that
Exactly.
eventually it led you to a path where, like, I'd like to know more about the culture. And I do
Mhm.
think that just I often think, you know, to me, what kind of world do we create if people are, you know, embarrassed of their grandparents speaking, right? It's unfortunate that
Right.
that was the kind of sense that your family
That's
had.
right.
And I think many
Yeah.
families maybe had
Mhm.
that. And
Yeah.
certainly it's just so difficult to think of people for whom millennia this was their place, to have it
Right.
rendered a space that became hostile or foreign to them like that.
Right.
If we can get back to where Ojibwe speakers and kids who hear Ojibwe feel proud to hear it and happy to hear it,
Yeah.
you know, that's a really good thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you
Agreed.
all, I think we're getting close to the end of the night. I wanted to do a big thank you to Margaret. That was wonderful, and it's great to learn from you every single time. I also want to remind people that we will be doing a session with Angeline on October 16th. That is going to be at 7 p.m. That's going to be Zoom. We invite you to do that. It's a free event. If you go to our website or if you email me, I'm happy to get you added to it. Also, I want to let you know that Mike Zimmerman Jr. will be teaching our Anishinaabe series that starts on Thursday. If you want to join in, I know that people sometimes have to miss a session. We prefer if you can make them all, but please know that we really would rather have you there than not attend at all. And if money is a barrier, there are all the levels. So we have 50% off and 100% off, so you can attend for free because we believe language learning is super important in our community. That's kind of my pitch for now, but I want to let you know that we continue this sessions and opportunities like this all the time. So if you have some suggestions for the future, please let me know so we can make sure that we are doing what we can do for you to continue conversations like this and learning opportunities. Also, I'm just going to say, if you need to hang on around for a minute or two to ask Margaret a question because maybe you just didn't get a chance, I encourage you to do that. But we also want to be respectful of her time. So I'm going to let you hang out, but thank you guys for coming tonight.
Welcome.
Yes,
Miigwech.
great to meet everybody. Yeah, me, what?